Millionaire takes a homeless woman into his mansion, then sees her photo on the wall and freezes. Gabriel adjusted his cufflinks, ignoring the slight tremble in his hands as he stared at the mirror. Another day, another deal, another meeting. His life was a cycle of success, yet he couldn't shake the persistent hollowness within. As the CEO of a thriving tech company, he had everything: wealth, power, and a reputation for being ruthless in business. But behind the sharp suits and commanding presence was a man haunted by regrets. On his way back from a gala that evening, his chauffeur slowed the car abruptly. Gabriel looked up, irritated. "What's the holdup, Michael?" "There's something happening up ahead," Michael replied, nodding toward a small crowd gathered near an alley. Gabriel sighed, loosening his tie. He didn't have time for distractions, but something about the scene caught his attention. A woman in tattered clothes stood firm, her voice sharp and unwavering as she shielded a young boy from a man twice her size. The boy cowered behind her, clutching a torn backpack. "You think you can just take what you want because we're on the streets?" she challenged, her tone steady despite her disheveled appearance. Her defiance was striking, a sharp contrast to the desperation Gabriel often associated with people like her. The man she confronted backed off, muttering under his breath before disappearing into the shadows. The crowd dispersed as quickly as it had gathered, leaving the woman and the boy alone. Gabriel leaned forward. Michael stopped the car. Stepping out, he approached the woman, who turned to face him, her eyes wary. "What do you want?" she asked, straightening her posture defensively. Gabriel ignored the hostility in her tone. "You handled that well. Not many people would have stood their ground like that." "I don't need compliments," she retorted. "Just help him," she added, gesturing to the boy. Gabriel studied her for a moment before shifting his gaze to the boy. "What's your name?" "Jake," the boy mumbled, not meeting Gabriel's eyes. Gabriel glanced back at the woman. "And you?" "Sarah. You have somewhere to stay?" Gabriel asked, his voice calm but direct. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering between him and the boy. "We'll manage." "That's not what I asked," Gabriel pressed. "Do you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight?" She clenched her jaw, her pride and practicality at war. Finally, she shook her head. "No, come with me," Gabriel said. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Why would you care?" Gabriel didn't flinch. "Because I can." Before she could argue further, he gestured to the car. "Take it or leave it." Sarah looked at Jake, then at Gabriel. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Fine, but only until I can figure something out." Gabriel opened the car door, gesturing for them to enter. As the car pulled away, Sarah sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the window. Gabriel leaned back in his seat, aware that he had just stepped into something far more complicated than he'd planned. The car ride was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engine. Gabriel kept his gaze ahead, though he occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror. Sarah sat stiffly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, while Jake fidgeted with the frayed straps of his backpack. The tension in the air was thick, a collision of worlds neither side understood. When they reached Gabriel's mansion, Jake's eyes widened as the gates swung open to reveal the sprawling property. The grand house loomed ahead, its windows glowing warmly against the evening sky. Sarah, however, remained unimpressed, her expression guarded. Gabriel stepped out first, gesturing for them to follow. Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave. Yet, the weight of Jake's small hand gripping hers pushed her forward. Inside, the house was as pristine and cold as she expected, an expanse of marble, glass, and steel that felt more like a museum than a home. "Maria," Gabriel called, and a middle-aged woman appeared from a side hallway. Her crisp uniform and composed demeanor suggested she was used to such summons. "Yes, sir," she replied, glancing curiously at Sarah and Jake. "Prepare a guest room," Gabriel said without elaboration. "And bring some clothes for them." Maria hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course," she replied after a beat, turning sharply on her heel. Gabriel turned back to Sarah. "You'll stay here for now. Maria will get you whatever you need." Sarah bristled at his tone, her jaw tightening. "I didn't ask for handouts, and I didn't offer one," Gabriel replied evenly. Consider it temporary assistance until you're back on your feet. I'm not some charity case, Sarah snapped, her voice low but firm. No, Gabriel said, meeting her gaze. You're a mother trying to protect her son. That's why I'm helping you. The bluntness of his words left Sarah momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth to argue, but found no retort. Instead, she exhaled sharply and turned away, focusing on Jake, who clung to her side. Maria returned moments later, motioning for them to follow her. Gabriel watched as Sarah led Jake down the hall, her head held high despite her obvious discomfort. There was a strength in her posture, a quiet defiance that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Alone again, Gabriel retreated to his study. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in the leather chair by the window. The night stretched out before him, quiet and still. Yet his mind was anything but. He thought of Sarah's sharp words, her guarded eyes, and the fierce way she had protected that boy on the street. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, Gabriel felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar pull that unsettled his carefully constructed world. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting uneasily on her lap. The room was more than she had ever dared to imagine. A king-sized bed with crisp white linens, tall windows framed by heavy curtains, and a walk-in closet that rivaled the size of most apartments she had lived in. It wasn't just luxury, it was a different world. Jake explored the room with wide-eyed curiosity, his small fingers trailing along the smooth surfaces of the furniture. Don't touch anything, Sarah warned, her voice sharper than she intended. Jake froze and looked at her, his expression deflated. She softened her tone. We need to be careful." Jake nodded and climbed onto the bed, curling up on the far corner. Sarah watched him for a moment before turning her gaze to the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. This wasn't her life. It couldn't be. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Maria entered, carrying a tray with sandwiches and juice. Her expression was neutral, but the disapproval in her eyes was hard to miss. She set the tray on the small table near the bed and straightened her posture. "Mr. Gabriel asked me to see if you need anything else," Maria said, her tone professional but clipped. Sarah shook her head. "We're fine." Maria's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before she turned to leave. As the door clicked shut, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She glanced at Jake, who was already nibbling on a sandwich, his earlier apprehension replaced by hunger. "Eat slowly," she reminded him, though her own stomach churned with unease. She sat down and picked up a sandwich, the simple act of eating in such a place feeling strangely surreal. Downstairs, Gabriel stood in the kitchen, staring at a bottle of water he had yet to open. He had planned to retreat to his study and let the night pass without further thought, but something gnawed at him. His conversation with Sarah replayed in his mind, her sharp words and defiant posture clashing with the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. "Second-guessing yourself, sir?" Maria's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Gabriel straightened. "No." Maria raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "You've never brought anyone like that into this house before?" Gabriel's jaw tightened. "It's temporary, if you say so," Maria said, turning to leave. She paused, glancing back. But temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent, especially when they stir up things you'd rather keep buried. Gabriel didn't reply, and Maria disappeared down the hall. He stared at the bottle of water for a moment longer before heading to his study. Temporary, he told himself. It's just temporary. In the guest room, Sarah lay awake long after Jake had fallen asleep. Her eyes traced the ceiling as doubts and questions swirled in her mind. Why had Gabriel helped her? What did he want in return? As much as she hated to admit it, the thought of having a roof over their heads, even for a little while, was a relief. But deep down, she knew nothing in life came without a cost. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the mansion, cutting through the crisp silence of the house. Gabriel stood in his dining room, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his mind lost in the endless to-do lists of his day. But his thoughts kept circling back to Sarah and Jake upstairs. He told himself it was nothing more than curiosity, yet the knot in his chest suggested otherwise. He decided to take a walk through the house, more to clear his mind than anything else. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished marble floors as he passed through the spacious living room. Gabriel paused near a shelf where framed photos from his childhood stood. Most of them had gone untouched for years, relics of a life he preferred to leave in the past. But today something caught his attention. At the far corner of the shelf sat an old photo he hadn't looked at in over a decade. It was from one of his father's charity trips, a black and white image of a younger Gabriel, barely 10 years old, standing beside his father, who wore his usual warm but authoritative smile. Surrounding them were a group of people from the small, impoverished community his father had worked with. Gabriel leaned closer, his gaze snagging on a face in the crowd. It was unmistakable. A much younger Sarah stood among the group, her face partially turned to the side, her posture timid but present. His grip on the coffee cup tightened as questions flooded his mind. Why was she there? How did she know his father? The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn sharply. It was Sarah, dressed in a loose sweatshirt Maria must have provided. Her eyes locked onto the photo he was holding, and her face froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Is this you?" Gabriel asked, holding the frame up to her. Sarah's expression hardened, her shoulders stiffening. "What does it matter?" "It matters," Gabriel said, his tone more demanding than he intended. "Why are you in this picture? How do you know my father?" Sarah stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Your father," she repeated, her voice carrying equal parts surprise and caution. "I didn't know this was his house." Gabriel's frustration boiled over. "That doesn't answer my question." "Because I don't owe you answers," Sarah snapped. "You helped me, and I'm grateful, but I don't have to explain my entire life to you." Gabriel took a step back, startled by the force in her voice. He set the photo frame down carefully, his mind racing. "You live in that community, didn't you? The one he visited?" Sarah's silence was confirmation enough. Her jaw tightened, and she crossed her arms as if to shield herself. "Your father helped us? That's all you need to know." Gabriel stared at her, the pieces slowly falling into place. This woman, who had walked into his life by chance, or so he thought, was connected to his father's legacy in a way he hadn't anticipated. And judging by the fire in her eyes, there was more to the story than she was letting on. "Fine," he said at last, his voice low. "But this conversation isn't over." Sarah turned without another word, heading back upstairs. Gabriel stood there for a long moment, staring at the photo. He had always thought of his father as a man consumed by work, a distant figure whose rare acts of kindness never seemed to reach him. But now, he wondered how much he truly knew about the man, and how Sarah fit into that picture. The tension from their earlier exchange lingered as Gabriel sat at his desk later that evening, the old photo resting in front of him. The faces stared back at him, frozen in time. His father's smile seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of how little Gabriel had understood the man who had loomed so large in his childhood. He picked up his phone, scrolling through old emails and contacts until he found the number for a retired associate of his father, Mr. Delgado. After a brief hesitation, Gabriel dialed. "Gabriel." Mr. Delgado's voice crackled through the line. "It's been years. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need information," Gabriel said, skipping the pleasantries. "About one of my father's old projects, specifically a community he worked with 25 years ago. Do you remember anything about it?" Delgado's voice softened. "I remember most of them. Your father was deeply committed to those initiatives. Which one are you referring to?" Gabriel described the photograph in detail, and there was a pause on the other end. "Ah, yes. That community," Delgado said slowly. "Your father spoke about them often. He was particularly concerned about the children there. Many of them had no stable families. One girl in particular stood out to him." Gabriel's chest tightened. "Sarah." "Yes, that was her name. A bright young girl with a lot of potential, but a difficult home life. He tried to ensure she had access to education and resources. Your father always said she deserved better than the hand she'd been dealt." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him. His father, a man he had always seen as distant and indifferent, had taken an interest in this girl's life. "Sarah." The same woman who now slept under his roof. Why didn't I know about this? Gabriel asked, his voice quieter. You were young, Gabriel, Delgado replied. Your father didn't share much with anyone outside of his inner circle. He believed actions mattered more than words. Gabriel thanked Delgado and ended the call, his thoughts churning. His father's hidden compassion for Sarah felt like a stark contrast to the cold, calculated man Gabriel had grown up resenting. How much of his father's life had Gabriel misunderstood? Upstairs, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, watching Jake as he drew on a scrap of paper with colored pencils Maria had brought him. Her earlier exchange with Gabriel had left her shaken. She thought she had buried the memories of his father, memories that carried both gratitude and pain. But seeing that photo had ripped the past wide open. Mom, Jake said softly, holding up his drawing. Do you think we'll stay here long? Sarah forced a smile. We'll figure it out, kiddo. One step at a time. She leaned back against the headboard, the weight of the past pressing down on her. Gabriel's father had been a beacon of hope during her darkest days, but his presence in her life had come with its own set of complications. And now, faced with Gabriel's piercing questions, she wasn't sure how long she could keep her secrets locked away. Meanwhile, Gabriel remained in his study, staring at the photo once more. He needed answers, and he knew Sarah had them. But how much would she be willing to share? And how much was he prepared to hear? For the first time in years, Gabriel felt something he couldn't quite name. An unease that perhaps the person he had become was no better than the man he had spent his life trying not to emulate. The next morning, Gabriel was greeted with an unusual stillness. The mansion, typically devoid of any true warmth, felt heavier than usual. He sat in the expansive dining room, his breakfast untouched. Maria moved silently through the room, her usual efficiency tempered by an unspoken tension. Where's our guest? Gabriel asked, breaking the silence. She and the boy are in the garden, Maria replied, her tone measured. She seems uneasy. Gabriel nodded, his thoughts already drifting. He pushed back his chair and made his way to the garden. Through the tall glass doors, he spotted Sarah sitting on a bench, her gaze distant, while Jake played with a ball near the hedges. As Gabriel stepped outside, the crisp morning air met him, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Sarah turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression tightening. We need to talk, Gabriel said, his voice steady but firm. Sarah raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. What now? He sat down on the bench, leaving space between them. I called someone who worked closely with my father. He began, watching her reaction. He told me about your connection to him. Sarah's jaw clenched, and she looked away. I figured you would. Why didn't you tell me? Gabriel asked. You've been in my home, knowing exactly who I am, yet you've said nothing. Sarah's laugh was bitter. What was I supposed to say? Hey, your father saved my life, but it didn't stop everything from falling apart. I'm sure that would have gone over well. Gabriel frowned. He tried to help you. He thought you deserved better. Her head snapped back toward him, her eyes blazing. He helped me, yes, but the world doesn't stop being cruel because one person shows you kindness. His help wasn't enough to save my family. It wasn't enough to stop what happened to us after he left. Gabriel's stomach twisted. What happened? Sarah shook her head, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her past had finally caught up to her. My father was an addict. No amount of charity could change that. Your father saw potential in me, but he didn't understand that it wasn't just me who needed saving. Gabriel stared at her, unsure of what to say. His father's well-intentioned actions had been a small ripple in the ocean of her struggles. He had always thought of his father's charity work as noble, a shining example of philanthropy. But now, faced with Sarah's raw truth, he saw the cracks in that image. Why didn't you tell him? Gabriel asked softly. Tell him what? Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. That no matter what he did, I was going to end up back where I started. He didn't need to carry that guilt. He did enough. Jake's laughter broke the tension as he ran toward them, holding up his ball triumphantly. Look, Mom, he said, his face bright with excitement. Sarah forced a smile and nodded. Good job, kiddo. Gabriel watched the interaction, his chest tightening. He couldn't ignore the parallels between Sarah's story and his own. His father's kindness had extended to strangers, but it had felt absent in their own home. Was this why? Had his father been trying to make amends for the love he couldn't give his own son? "I want to help you," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with skepticism. "Help me how?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I need to do something. For you. For Jake. For my father." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her guard still up. "You can't fix the past, Gabriel. And you can't undo what's been done." "Maybe not," he said. "But I can try to make things right now." She looked away, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." Gabriel nodded, knowing that her trust wouldn't come easily. As she stood and walked back toward the mansion with Jake in tow, he remained on the bench, lost in thought. The ghosts of the past were no longer content to stay hidden, and for the first time, Gabriel wasn't sure if he could face them alone. Gabriel couldn't sleep that night. The conversation with Sarah had left him restless, his mind tangled in conflicting emotions. As he stared at the ceiling of his darkened room, memories of his father swirled through his thoughts. How had he missed this side of the man? A father who was present in the lives of strangers but absent in his own son's life? At dawn, Gabriel made his way to the kitchen. He found Maria already there, preparing breakfast with her usual efficiency. She looked up, surprised to see him this early. "Couldn't sleep," Gabriel muttered, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Maria studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've been thinking about her." Gabriel didn't deny it. "She's more connected to my father than I ever realized." Maria's movement slowed. "Your father always saw potential in people. Maybe he saw something in her he wished he had seen in himself." Gabriel frowned, but didn't reply. Maria rarely commented on personal matters, but her words lingered as he carried his coffee to the study. Later that morning, Gabriel found Sarah in the library, a book open on her lap. Jake sat on the floor nearby, surrounded by the scattered pieces of a puzzle. Sarah looked up when Gabriel entered, her expression wary. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Gabriel began, standing a few feet away. "About how my father's help wasn't enough." Sarah's brow furrowed, and she closed the book. "What about it?" Gabriel took a breath, his voice steady but tinged with something raw. "There's something you should know. My father wasn't the man I thought he was either. Not entirely. He spent so much of his time helping others, but he didn't know how to be there for his own family." Sarah tilted her head, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded demeanor. "So why do you care now?" "Because I'm starting to understand why he did what he did," Gabriel admitted. "And because I see what he saw in you. Someone who deserves more than the hand they were dealt." Sarah stood, crossing her arms as she stepped closer. "You think you understand me? You have no idea what it's like to lose everything and still have to fight for scraps." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You're right, I don't. But that doesn't mean I'm not trying." Sarah's gaze softened for a moment, but then she sighed, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Trying doesn't change what's already happened. It doesn't bring back what I lost." "What did you lose, Sarah?" Gabriel asked, his tone gentler now. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. "My family, my home, my sense of safety. After your father left, things got worse. My dad's addiction spiraled. My mom couldn't handle it. We lost our house. And by the time I was old enough to leave, there was nothing left to salvage." Gabriel felt the weight of her words, a sharp pang of guilt cutting through him. "I didn't know. Why would you?" Sarah said, her voice steady but heavy. "You were living your life while mine fell apart. Your father meant well, but his kindness wasn't enough to change the system that crushed us." Gabriel sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly. "I don't know if I can change the past, but I want to help now. For you, for Jake, for my father's memory." Sarah studied him, her expression unreadable. "Help how? By giving me a place to stay? By throwing money at the problem?" "No," Gabriel said firmly. "By listening, by understanding, and by using what I have to make sure Jake doesn't have to go through what you did." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting to Jake, who was oblivious to the weight of their conversation. After a long pause, she said softly, "If you want to help, start by seeing us as people, not projects." Gabriel nodded, her words cutting deep. "I'll try." As he left the room, Sarah sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't ready to trust him, but for the first time, she wondered if he truly could make a difference. Gabriel sat in his study, staring at the old photograph on his desk. The image, once a reminder of his father's philanthropic efforts, now felt like a window into a life he had misunderstood. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, each syllable heavy with a truth he couldn't ignore. His father's intentions, no matter how noble, hadn't shielded Sarah from the hardships that followed. And Gabriel's own choices, though distant from her story, carried consequences he was just beginning to confront. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. Sarah stood in the doorway, her expression guarded but resolute. "We need to talk." Gabriel gestured to the chair across from him, and she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She didn't sit. Instead, she remained standing, her arms crossed tightly. "I can't stay here if we're going to keep circling around the truth," Sarah began, her tone steady but charged. "You want to help? Then you need to know the whole story." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm listening." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers gripping her arms as if to steady herself. "After your father left our community, things got worse. The donations he arranged helped for a while, but when they dried up, so did the support. My dad couldn't stay clean. My mom worked herself into the ground trying to keep us afloat. And when the bills piled up, we lost the house." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "I dropped out of school to help, but no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. By the time I was 17, I was living on the streets. And the worst part?" She leaned forward, her voice sharpening. "The land we lost? It was bought by your company." Gabriel's chest tightened, her words cutting through him like a blade. "What are you talking about?" She laughed bitterly. "Your father's charity gave us hope, but your success took everything else. When your company expanded, it swallowed up properties like ours. The only place I ever called home was turned into a parking lot for your investors." Gabriel felt the air leave his lungs. He hadn't been directly involved in those decisions, but he couldn't deny his company's role. "Sarah, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," she snapped. "You were too busy building your empire to see the lives you were destroying." Gabriel stood, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not my father, and I'm not the man who made those decisions. But I'm the man standing in front of you now, trying to make things right." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You think you can just undo the damage? That a roof over my head and some food on the table will fix everything?" "No," Gabriel admitted. "But I can start by acknowledging what's been done, and by taking responsibility for my part in it." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their shared pain filling the space between them. Then Sarah spoke, her voice softer now. "Responsibility isn't just about guilt, Gabriel. It's about action. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Gabriel nodded slowly. "Then tell me how. Tell me where to start." Sarah studied him, her defenses still raised but faltering under the sincerity in his voice. "You start by listening, and by understanding that this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been told their life doesn't matter because someone else wanted more." Gabriel exhaled deeply, her words settling into the deepest parts of him. "I'll listen," he said, "and I'll do more than that. I'll act." She nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "We'll see." As she left the room, Gabriel sank back into his chair, his resolve solidifying. The ghosts of his past had become his present, and he knew that redemption wouldn't come easily. But for the first time, he was willing to confront the legacy he'd inherited and to change the path forward. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. Gabriel stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in his study, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. But the view, once a source of pride, now felt like a reminder of everything he had built on a foundation he barely understood. Sarah's words replayed in his mind, her voice filled with both anger and undeniable truth. He had spent years ignoring the ripple effects of his decisions, but now those ripples were crashing down on him. He reached for the old photograph on his desk, studying it for what felt like the 100th time. His father's face, so familiar yet so distant, stared back at him. Gabriel had always believed his father's kindness was a distraction from the responsibilities he had neglected at home. Now he saw it differently. Perhaps his father's acts of charity had been an attempt to atone for something. But atone for what? The door creaked open behind him, and Maria stepped in, her hands clasped in front of her. She had been with the family long enough to sense when something weighed heavily on Gabriel's mind. "You've been in here all day," she said softly. Gabriel didn't turn. "Did you know about my father's connection to Sarah?" Maria hesitated before answering. "I knew he helped her community. He never spoke of her specifically, but I remember him mentioning a young girl with potential. I assumed it was just another one of his projects." "Projects," Gabriel muttered, the word bitter in his mouth. "That's what she said too, that I see people as projects." Maria stepped closer, her voice firm but gentle. "Your father didn't see her as a project. He saw her as a person worth helping. But he was just one man. He couldn't fix everything. Neither can I," Gabriel admitted, his voice strained. "But I can't just do nothing." Maria gave him a small, approving nod. "Then don't." As she left, Gabriel's resolve hardened. He couldn't change what had happened to Sarah or her family, but he could take responsibility for the role his company had played. He grabbed his laptop and began searching through old records, his heart sinking as he uncovered the acquisition files for the land Sarah had mentioned. It had been part of an aggressive expansion strategy spearheaded during his early years as CEO. At the time, it had been nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. Now, it was a symbol of everything he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. Hours passed, and Gabriel's focus sharpened. He made a list of the properties affected, the people displaced, and the communities disrupted. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about all the lives his company had impacted. He began drafting a plan, his fingers flying across the keyboard as if making up for lost time. The next morning, he found Sarah in the kitchen with Jake, who was quietly munching on toast. Sarah looked up as Gabriel entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I have something to show you," he said, holding up a folder. "But only if you're willing to listen." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. They moved to the living room, where Gabriel spread the documents across the coffee table. He explained everything, the land acquisitions, the decisions made under his leadership, and his plans to start reparations for the damage caused. Sarah listened intently, her expression unreadable. "You're really doing this?" she asked when he finished. "I am," Gabriel said firmly. "Not because I think it will fix everything, but because it's the right thing to do." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "It's a start." Gabriel exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "It's not just about the past, Sarah. It's about making sure no one else goes through what you did." She leaned back, her arms crossed. "Actions speak louder than words, Gabriel. I'll believe it when I see it." Her skepticism was warranted, and Gabriel didn't argue. He had spent years ignoring the consequences of his choices. Earning her trust would take more than a few promises. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. As Sarah left the room, Gabriel allowed himself a small, fleeting moment of hope. Redemption wouldn't come easily, but he was ready to fight for it, one step at a time. Gabriel stood outside the mansion, the morning air crisp and still. The first rays of sunlight touched the edges of the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the sprawling gardens. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet sense of purpose, though the weight of what lay ahead still lingered. Today was the beginning of something different. Not redemption, perhaps, but accountability. Inside, Sarah packed her few belongings into a small bag. Jake sat on the bed, watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Are we leaving?" he asked softly. Sarah paused, her hands resting on the bag. "Not yet, buddy. We're just figuring things out." Jake nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Sarah glanced around the room, her heart conflicted. The mansion was everything she had once dreamed of for Jake, a safe, stable place to stay. But it was also a reminder of everything she had lost, everything that had been taken from her. Trusting Gabriel still felt like stepping onto thin ice, but his actions in the last few days had stirred something unfamiliar in her, a fragile, hesitant hope. In the dining room, Gabriel had laid out a series of documents on the table, each detailing his plans for reparations. Sarah entered cautiously, Jake trailing behind her. Gabriel looked up, his expression softening. "I wanted to go over this with you before we finalize anything," he began, gesturing to the papers. "It's not just about repairing the damage. It's about creating something better." Sarah stepped closer, scanning the documents. She saw plans for scholarships, housing initiatives, and investments in communities like the one she had grown up in. Each page was meticulously detailed, and though she knew it wouldn't undo the past, it was a start. Jake tugged at her sleeve. "What is it, Mom?" Sarah smiled faintly, ruffling his hair. "It's a plan to help people like us." Gabriel knelt beside Jake, his voice gentle. "It's also a plan to make sure kids like you have a chance to dream big and make those dreams come true." Jake's eyes lit up, and he grinned shyly. "Really? Really?" Gabriel said, standing back up. Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Gabriel. "You're serious about this?" "As serious as I've ever been," Gabriel replied. "But I can't do it alone. I need people like you to guide me, to make sure I don't lose sight of what matters." Sarah hesitated, her walls still partially intact. But as she looked at Jake, she saw a spark of something she hadn't seen in years: hope. She turned back to Gabriel, her expression softening. "Then let's see if you can keep up." A small smile touched Gabriel's lips. Challenge accepted. Over the next few weeks, the mansion became a hub of activity. Gabriel worked tirelessly, reaching out to former colleagues, community leaders, and anyone who could help bring his vision to life. Sarah found herself drawn into the process, her insights proving invaluable as they navigated the complexities of rebuilding trust and offering meaningful aid. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Gabriel and Sarah began to ease. Conversations that had once been sharp and guarded became collaborative, even warm. Slowly, they started to see each other not as adversaries or saviors, but as equals. Two people trying to make sense of their broken pasts while shaping a better future. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Gabriel stood on the balcony, watching Jake play in the garden below. Sarah joined him, leaning on the railing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "He's happy here," Sarah said finally, her voice soft. Gabriel nodded. "He deserves to be." "So do you," she added, glancing at him. "But that's something only you can figure out." Gabriel smiled faintly. "I'm working on it." As they stood there, side by side, the weight of the past didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. They weren't finished, not by a long shot. But for the first time, they were moving forward, together. Sometimes, life brings together the most unlikely people to teach us the most profound lessons. Gabriel and Sarah's story reminds us that redemption is not found in words but in action, and that healing the wounds of the past begins with courage, humility, and the willingness to make a difference. Now it's your turn. What would you do if faced with the chance to change someone's life? Or your own? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If the story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and help spread its message. And if you believe in the power of stories to inspire change, subscribe to our channel for more narratives that touch the heart and ignite the soul. Your next step could be the beginning of someone else's transformation.